Thank you for joining today's webinar sponsored by VETRO. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Joan Engebretson. I'm Executive Editor at Telecompetitor. Thank you for taking time out today to discuss a public-private partnership success model, a Connect Maine Authority case study. We very much appreciate you taking time today to learn about what's a really hot topic right now in this industry. I did want to let everyone know that the webinar is being recorded. Before we begin today's webinar, I'd like to recognize and thank our exclusive sponsor, VETRO. VETRO builds software that makes it radically simpler and faster for broadband providers to plan, design, build, and operate their fiber optic networks. The company's map-based software as a service platform is easier to use and more powerful than traditional tools, and it enables network owners, operators, and sponsors to benefit from a modern, integrated, and connected digital hub for their physical network assets. The company delivers internet infrastructure intelligence. So our goals for today are to discuss a case study of the Connect Maine Authority funding success, leveraging public-private partnerships for broadband success, and success factors for the upcoming BEAD program. That's the big funding program that has $42.5 billion for rural broadband. Attendees can use the Q&A tool on your screen toolbar to enter questions. Feel free to enter those questions as they come up. You don't have to wait until the end to ask them, although we will answer the questions at the end of the panel discussion. So we're fortunate to have several people with considerable experience in public-private partnerships and broadband deployment with us today. Representing VETRO today are Brian Mefford and Will Mitchell. Brian is Vice President of Broadband Strategy for VETRO and has a range of experience in shaping federal and state broadband programs and leading community broadband efforts in rural areas. Prior to VETRO, he founded Connected Nation, a nonprofit focused on enriching community broadband access. He regularly provides testimony for state and federal legislatures and has consulted with the FCC, the NTIA, USDA, and the State Department. Will Mitchell is CEO and co-founder of VETRO. He has deep experience in GIS, Geographic Information System design, deployment, and operations, which enables VETRO to deliver high-value geospatial business insight and product vision. Will leads a diverse technical team that delivers a transformational and category-expanding fiber management software platform. He has a Master of Science degree in Geographic and Cartographic Science from George Mason University and a BS in Foreign Service from Georgetown University. Peggy Schaffer is Executive Director for Connect Maine Authority, which is Maine's program to expand broadband to unserved areas of the state. There, she is responsible for budgets, grant processes, and public outreach. In the past year, Peggy has led Connect Maine in developing a verification and validation process for infrastructure grants and a broadband intelligence platform and a structure to support communities in the development of broadband utility districts. Under her leadership, Connect Maine made a successful application to the NTIA Broadband Infrastructure Program, and all of these things will be a key focus of our panel discussion today. Prior to joining Connect Maine, Peggy was the small business advocate in the Secretary of State's office and co-chair for the Maine Broadband Coalition. I invite Peggy to come on screen now, and I'll introduce Frederic Feit, who is the manager of broadband consulting for Tilson. It's a telecom services firm on a mission to design and build America's 21st century telecom infrastructure. He is highly experienced in middle mile and last mile network analysis and planning for telecom companies, municipalities, tribal providers, and other broadband providers. He also has extensive experience with regulatory compliance and with federal and state broadband funding opportunities. He represented various broadband providers in the Connect America Fund auction, a process that included business plan development, competitive analysis, network engineering and optimization, cost and cost recovery analysis, regulatory review, and negotiation. And finally, we have Mike Wilson. Mike, if you're not already on screen, I invite you to join us. Mike is Vice President of Business Development for CostQuest, a consulting firm specializing in broadband costs, network modeling, valuations, and economics. Mike focuses on rural telecom policy, universal service funding, interconnection, and operational analysis. Prior to joining CostQuest, he managed wireless interconnection at Western Wireless, Alltel, and before that, he was an analyst in the messaging division at AT&T Wireless, McCaw. Mike has served as an expert witness for intercarrier compensation, universal service and local number portability proceedings in several states, and has co-authored policy papers regarding USF high-cost funding. So our format today will be a panel discussion with Brian acting as the moderator. So Brian, please take it away.
Joan, thank you. And thanks again to each of our panelists. Welcome all the audience members. We're so pleased to have you with us today and are excited about our time together. We're going to jump right into it, but I can't help but remark on that previous slide. Peggy, I can't let that go by without saying there's something about the rose among the thorns in that last slide there. But you're the reason we're here. You've made the success of Connect Maine possible over these last few years, and so we're glad to get to come around you and help tell the story today. Before I flip it over to you, Peggy, let me just do a little bit more table setting, because we do have just a wildly diverse audience with us today in terms of where people are coming from for this webinar. And we're gathered here today because we want to and intend to offer you some value over these next 45 minutes. And we have folks who are from towns and cities, rural counties, state leadership positions. We also have internet service providers. We have middle mile builders and operators. Again, and then other nonprofits that are involved in sort of digital equity and access. So we're covering the ecosystem today. There should be value for everybody across the ecosystem in what you'll hear today. Primarily because, and practically all joking aside, you get invited into the mind of Peggy, a state leader who has, see that face, Peggy. We'll compartmentalize a bit today, but to see what is involved from a state leadership standpoint, whether you're an operator, an ISP, or a community leader, it's vitally important that you sort of understand what's at stake at the state level, because these dollars are funding through our state offices. Appreciate the questions coming in. There's already one, Fred, about middle mile, which I think you'll be probably eager to chime in on. But we'll get to hopefully all the questions that are coming in. If not, we'll address these afterwards. So that's a bit about the audience who's with us today. Let me just say, we're taking a bit of creative license here in sort of connecting the dots, but not much creative license between the success that Peggy's team and Connect Maine had in winning grant dollars in the round that was released roughly last fall and awarded early spring, maybe late winter this year. We're connecting the dots because we want to say, okay, what happened there looks a lot like what should happen with the BEAD program. And let me just read just some of the sort of commonalities. So the two things are, they resemble each other in the fact that in the sense that they're, NTIA released program parameters and preferences and requirements that had to be sort of absorbed and massaged and understood at the state level, so that requests for participation and cooperation and collaboration could be issued to all the parties in the state, particularly the internet service providers and local leaders. Eligible areas had to be defined. Fabric data was deployed very effectively in this case, and made really the world of difference in putting together the proposal and then defending it and then winning the projects. There was an RFI that was issued for ISP engagement. There was a lot of local engagement that Peggy had established going into this grant round that was already in process and helped to solidify the application. There was project selection that took place. There was a challenge process. There were vendors awarded projects that represent a variety of business models. So not just ISP business models, but Peggy, I'll leave that, won't steal thunder there, but that's an exciting part of this. The projects began to be built, constructed, and also promoted statewide. And now those projects are in sort of project tracking mode and sort of communicating on a regular basis. So those are some of the commonalities. And one thing that's probably similar to, like, again, before I sort of pose 5 questions that I want our panel to start weighing in on, starting with Peggy. This round was oversubscribed by roughly 10x. And so if there were $80 million roughly available, there were applications, and I might get this not exactly right, but roughly 800 million in applications. And Peggy's team won 28 million of those awards. So an extraordinary accomplishment, significant. So that's why we're here today, is to share what happened, what's best practices, how does it apply going forward. So with that, the 5 questions that we'll tend to try to address with the audience today is, what did Connect Maine do exactly to set itself up for that kind of success? Who were partners in this effort? What were the data that were used and leveraged, and particularly how did Connect Maine engage with internet service providers, operators? How did you assess middle mile, and then how did you engage with communities? So that's about 10 hours of content that we're going to spend the next 40 minutes now diving into. So with that said, let me get out of the way of you, Peggy, and turn it over to you for comments.
Yeah, so first off, Connect Maine is the state broadband authority. We are a quasi-public instrumentality of the state. So we don't live in state government, we live slightly outside of state government. And that structure is really important because it means that we can move without going through state bureaucracy, which allowed us to move quickly in this grant. The RFI, the NOFO came out last spring. We had roughly a month, 2 months to put it together. And the key piece of the starting point was that the notice of funding opportunity said that either the state or a political subdivision of the state had to be the lead applicant. And I knew in Maine, nobody else would do this if the state didn't do it. And so I talked to my board chair and I said, we should apply for this. And we should apply for as much money as we can get out of it. They had set a sort of maximum of $30 million. And I said, and we should hire people to write this for us, right? Because I have myself and one other staff. And by that, we had already brought on VETRO to develop a broadband intelligence platform, and Tilson Technologies to help with our grants validation process. So for us, because we were outside of state government, it was very easy to sort of get contracts going and get people lined up to go. The first thing we did was issue an RFI, which was based on the requirements of the NOFO, right? So that was a key element of it. I think we got 13 responses, 7 of which were from the Blue Hill Peninsula, and then 6 were from other parts of the state. When we looked those over, we looked at a number of things because cost was important and the number of people you serve was important. And so those were key driving factors. The other piece that was important was that counties, they preferred counties with less than 50,000 people. So we had some pretty rural areas that applied who should have really been a great fit, except for the fact that they lived in counties where there was more than 50,000 people. And so that was always hard calls to make, right? Call a very rural area of the state and say, you're not really eligible for this because your county's too big. And then what we did was VETRO helped us. They anticipated this. And so they mapped out where in the state had low quality of service and high density. That's a kind of an interesting mix, right? A high density of people and low quality service, because cost and the number of passes matter. The more lower your cost and the more people you connected, the higher you were going to score. And then using that information, we then from the RFI, we pulled out about, I think it was about $15 million in grants that we wanted to, the projects that we wanted to include. We then went back to providers and said, look, here's the map that shows us that this area would be really good for this project. Would you be interested in putting a project together for this area? And we expanded we doubled the size of the grant from about 15,000 to almost $30 million. We had to do that really fast. So the team that we engaged, Tilson and VETRO, was central to that effort. As we move forward on this, the other pieces that were incredibly, were that continued team was part of how we drew out the network. This grant also asked for you to blow apart census districts and go into them and make sure you were serving the locations within a census block that were unserved. So this was not an effort that you did by census block. It was, you had to broke it apart. And so the database and the work that we did with VETRO and with Tilson was central to putting together a very competitive application. And so it was a whirlwind of work, and the team that we put in place was central to our success.
Peggy, perfect. Thank you. And there's a few things I'll sort of come back to in a bit, but I want to get out of the way of the rest of the panel too, and let folks comment. And Will, I'll turn to you next. I know you've got some visuals that can illustrate some of the things that Peggy just referenced, and we'll get those pulled up. And then Fred and Mike will come to you for additional comments after Will.
All right, thanks, Brian. Will Mitchell here, the CEO of VETRO. Good to be with everybody. Thank you, Peggy and Brian, for setting the stage. There is a slide or two that we can take a look at because I'm a map person and we like to look at maps together to help illustrate a little bit about what Peggy was talking about, but also just as a backdrop to storytell against. And, you know, I'm going to be quick with these just to give a flavor of the story we're talking through, and to give a visual of what the mapping environment looks like in VETRO. This is a web-based GIS, and what you're seeing on the screen here are broadband investment zones from the NTIA program that we were talking about, either fully unserved or what we called maybe unserved, where there was some ambiguity or partial definition match. But just taking that bird's eye view, if you flip to the next slide, we go down. And this is a little bit of a derivative output that Peggy was talking about. It's essentially a translation of the preferences and requirements of the NTIA grant program, delineated in geography and polygons, ranked by best fit. You know, which areas of the state are most likely to be awarded funding against that criteria set. And the green puzzle pieces on the screen were the ones that jump to the top, and they are, you know, based on a combination of variables, including that density factor and rurality combination. So the areas that don't have good service, that are rather rural, but have a fair amount of density, kind of rose to the top. And that's just an example of some derivative works that go into some mapping like this. And if you go to the next slide, you will see, moving down a level in scale, these red areas are actually the actual areas that were submitted and funded through the grant program. And I like to look at different scales, and you start to see, you know, some real impact when it comes to what's going to get built and covered. These are some significant areas, quite a few towns in different areas of the state. And you can go on down one more slide. There's a story here that Peggy may want to elaborate on a little bit, but this is a town called Deer Isle off the coast of Maine, beautiful part of the world. Just to illustrate what's on the screen here, we've got, again, some known unserved and some maybe unserved locations. Important, this is CostQuest data, the CostQuest location fabric, and it's worth spending time on that. I'm sure Mike can elaborate some in a moment, but going from census block geography or any polygon type area geography down to address specific locations is a big important part of what's happening across the industry and driving both reporting and funding decision making. And if you go on to the next slide, you will see here, this opens up another avenue or line of discussion, but you're seeing here the purple are census blocks that are designated to be with good service. The speed classification of these was 120, in fact, from the FCC 477. The dots on top are speed tests that came in from the Maine Broadband Coalition's public speed test collection site. And the dots here indicate locations that were coming in at below 25 or below, even below 10 down. So in contradiction to that the statement that these areas are well served. And you know, that's another discussion altogether, but I think it's important to raise these concepts of polygons versus points, if you're a map nerd like me, and different definitions of who's served, who's well served and who's not. Going to the next slide, if you would. And then, you know, we're a product company. We're delivering a GIS platform that's very vertically focused on broadband and on fiber management in particular. This is a depiction of routes that were submitted by a builder who wanted to go build fiber in this town, and will now be doing so as a result of Peggy's success and efforts in partnership. And so you're beginning to see more and more layers of detail. And if you go on one more slide, jumping around here again, this might go back to something Fred likes to talk about as well, but some of the green areas here are submitted build areas from other grant funded projects from Connect Maine in relation to an old BTOP funded middle mile route that's available for connection and backhaul to reach those areas. And I think that's an important upcoming discussion on funding middle mile grants and middle mile build as it pertains to reaching last mile build out areas into towns and to locations. One more slide. Finally, this is just a shameless plug for VETRO Fiber Map as a fiber management solution. You can take that planning level of mapping in detail and continue down. Our core market is the ISP space, those who are building and managing fiber networks. And the same tooling can get you inside the fiber cables and into managing connectivity and actual fiber management over time. So that's it for the slides. And Brian, I don't know, I think time constraints, me and I should be quiet and let you move on to the next guests.
We will, but we'll come back. There were a couple of questions that generated, and we'll come back to that. I want to pivot to Fred. Fred, there are already some questions around, you know, that we can clarify for folks. What's actually happening here on the map, that those green network design lines? Who's building what was awarded in Maine? And maybe if you don't mind talking a bit about the process of project evaluation and even maybe get into the challenge process a bit.
Sure, thank you, Brian. So the participants are very interesting. The eligible applicants for this particular program, the NTIA BIP program, Broadband Infrastructure Program, was different than many other grant programs. The definition of an eligible applicant was a public-private partnership. And while public-private partnerships are often encouraged or allowed for other grant programs, this one was specifically limited in eligibility to public-private partnerships. So that was unique. Of course, in this case, the public entity was not only Connect Maine, but three communities, three towns in the state of Maine that will end up owning the infrastructure. And in addition, the private partners were Consolidated Communications, so one of the country's largest telecommunications company, and two smaller regional Maine internet service providers, Axiom and LCI. Among those three private partners, there are 7 project areas. Technically, 3 of them are contiguous to one another, but they have different network developers and network owners, but the others are non-contiguous. One of them is an unbridged island in Maine that's obviously not contiguous to anything. So Consolidated is building or will be responsible for 3 project areas, Rangeley, I'm starting to name them specifically now, I have to remember, the Blue Hill Peninsula and forgive me. Farmington, excuse me. Yeah, right near Rangeley. Axiom is also responsible for developing 3 projects. One is the Isle of Howe, then the town of Washington and the town of Somerville. And it is those 3 projects where those communities were technically co-applicants on the application and will be the owner of the fiber assets once they are constructed. And the other participant, LCI, has 1 project area, and that's the town of Jefferson. The evaluation of the projects was interesting. So the NTIA did look at efficiency of cost, but on a cost per premise passed basis. So I mean, and that's something that's fairly common for grant programs. They want to see a lot of bang for the buck, so to speak, but it also isn't very friendly to the most rural communities in America, right? There should be maybe, well, this is in my opinion, but just like the rural electrification project, there are locations that will remain on the wrong side of the digital divide as long as grant programs, federal or state, continue to emphasize the number of homes per mile, so to speak. But that was a factor, and that was, as Peggy mentioned earlier, we did put a fair bit of effort, the team did, in the early stages to identify areas that would score well. And that's really important in programs such as this, and really any grant program. The folks administering the grant program undeniably want to do the right thing, but the program has specific rules. It has to have specific parameters and 4 corners and walls, and you have to stay within the parameters of the grant program, and the application has to score highly. The budget actually initially was $288 million, and they received applications, I believe, over $2 billion. So it was like a 9.5 or so factor of oversubscription. So highly competitive, but not unusual for grant programs. They're that competitive, and the applications have to score very, very highly. And you have to be very specific with the criteria. You asked for a couple comments on the challenge process. It was interesting, a little frustrating in that the eligible locations could include in the initial part of the application. Eligible locations can include unserved locations within partially served census blocks. And that's kind of the golden unicorn of broadband availability. It's hard to identify at the street address level unserved locations inside of census blocks that are reported as served on the FCC Form 77 filings. Of course, the FCC is moving towards a more granular data collection process, which will hopefully ultimately reveal unserved locations in these partially served census blocks. But having the appropriate data, which was supplied by CostQuest, it's very, very important data, which allows us to identify at the street address level unserved locations, likely unserved locations inside of these partially served census blocks. However, when it came to the challenge process was in a way conducted at the census block level, where the challengers reported a challenge to a particular geographic area on the census block level. So we had to kind of go back into the process and show the methodology used for determining unserved locations within the partially served census blocks. But you have to be able to make that case very convincingly. because as far as the federal government's concerned, the end all be all of data for served versus unserved historically and still presently is the Form 477 data. So you do have to show the methodology that is used and the quality of the data that's used to pluck out, if you will, the unserved locations within the partially served census blocks. And that was challenging, but we had very good data to start with. We had the CostQuest data and we had VETRO's graphical representation and data processing of the CostQuest data. So we were well positioned to respond to the challenge process. And I think we did very well with the challenge process. We had very, very few locations actually removed from the funding for the project.
Well said, Fred, and expert segue there. Thank you for that, and also for the correct figures on the oversubscription. I should not do math publicly out loud. So thank you for correcting that, Mike. Data are important in this mix. CostQuest has some good stuff. And let's not miss an opportunity to talk here. You talk about what you want to, but don't want to miss the fact that Maine has used sort of a broader swath of CostQuest data than just the fabric. I know you're going to talk about the fabric particularly, but over to you.
Yeah, no, Brian, I appreciate it. And you and I both know, and Peggy working on SBI 10 plus years ago, that good data were hard to come by. And there's plenty of good data now. Here's what we supplied to the program to lead to success in the grant application process. As both Fred and Will talked about, location level mapping is pretty critical. We provided the broadband serviceable location fabric for the entire state of Maine. It's similar to what we're providing to the FCC for the national fabric. It's location structures, buildings that can be connected with the internet, right? On top of that, layered on top of that kind of foundational data that is accurate locations is service availability data that went into what Fred just described as a tough challenge process. So we have service availability data below the census block that is more accurate than what you get from the 477 data. It's a logistical regression model that estimates what technology is available at each one of those structures needing service, right? So fiber, coax, hybrid fiber coax, DSL, etc. Right, so that data were used to support broadband availability mapping and, like Fred said, the challenge process. And then lastly, what we provided also was our cost modeling. So we did cost modeling statewide to unserved locations for fiber, typical GPON deployment, which lent itself to the application and submitting something that led to the likelihood of funding analysis that we talked about earlier. But I think you all know that you know, the data are only as good as the folks that are using it. Couple key things here, and this is probably the best example. We've worked in a number of states, probably best example of good practical use of data. Data visualization and management is key. Having a platform like the VETRO Fiber Map, the Broadband Intelligence Platform, critical. Right, and then having people that know the data, that have managed grant programs, that come from a design build engineering background is critical. So from Fred and his team and Peggy, having that expertise to manipulate the data, use the data in an application is also critical. So we work in many states together with Tilson and VETRO. But this is probably the best example of all those things coming together effectively. And I think, Peggy and Connect Maine kind of are at that forefront of the intersection of data and policy, and that is super helpful.
That's great, Mike. Thanks for that. And maybe we'll make news today with some announcements of other states we're working in together, but I'll leave that for later. Peggy, Mike made a great point that I know that you espouse with your peers among state leadership around the country, which is the value of collaboration. And you've made that happen in Maine. It's perhaps the most mission critical thing you've achieved from my perspective. Maybe speak to that. I'm not asking you to sort of brag on the folks around the panel here, because your view of collaboration starts, I think, locally, not to put words in your mouth, but it has included local leaders, it's included citizens, it's included the internet service providers that are interested in being at the table. In some cases, those who aren't at first, but then they get the Peggy call and they get interested. And then it's this team that's here that's sort of a tight team around your operation. So have at it.
I mean, for us, all of this starts with community planning. We were actually calling this grant because the VETRO platform for us is called the Broadband Intelligence Platform, which is the BIP, and then this grant's the BIP. We get too many BIPs. So we're calling this grant Connect the Ready, Mountains to the Sea, because it really, that is what this is, right? This is from the Western Mountains out to the ocean. And one of the key elements of this process was, in fact, the community planning that Maine's engaged in for about 5 or 6 years. You know, I joke and said, Maine hasn't had a lot of money. So what we've done is a lot of planning. And what that does is it sets a stage for a project like this to be successful. So the Blue Hill Peninsula had, like I said, it had 7 responses to the RFI. So there was 2 internet service providers who came in. There was communities that came in who thought, you know, we're going to build this on ourselves. We're going to contract with an ISP to build this ourselves. But that was a result of many years of work of that community having a deep understanding of both of what they wanted, what they needed, what where was served and where was unserved, which is really central to the challenge process, right? One of these communities had used VETRO, and so they gave us VETRO maps that showed what they'd gone out and mapped everything. And so that was really helpful to the challenge process. Some of the other communities have been engaged in planning for a while. One had been turned down for a USDA grant. And you know, the one in Rangeley, they just they've been talking about it for a while. They just never pulled the trigger, right? And so this really that footprint, that base allowed us to have something to start with, right? We knew the areas, we knew what parties were engaged in these conversations. And so when we began to figure out, we needed a bigger grant, right? I wasn't going to submit a $15 million grant when I could submit a $30 million grant. I went to those places and said, you know, this area fits. Would you be interested in being part of this process? And, you know, that's how we brought LCI on board. CCI came in with 2 additional projects, the Rangeley project and the Farmington project, the town-owned projects, Somerville, Washington, and Idaho. We originally were going to include Matinicus, which is a little further out, but they said they didn't want internet on Matinicus. And so that was central to this process. So it isn't, you know, Maine, we're not a big state. We know each other. I joke sort of that we don't call ISPs by their company name. We call them by the person that we talk to all the time. So it's not CCI, it's Sarah. It's not Axiom, it's Mark. And so that is that's a piece of the DNA that made this process so successful. And that's because I think we're all very committed to getting this work done, and we just need the tools. We just needed the money and we needed the tools. And this grant helped us provide the money. And these 2 the contractors really helped us provide the tools that we were able to put this project together.
Great. Thank you, Peggy. Fred, I'm going to turn back to you. There are a couple of middle mile questions, and I don't necessarily want us to go, you know, down the middle mile rabbit trail, but it's poignant here because that factored in to the project evaluation with these projects, but also now looking forward to BEAD funding. That it looks like that's going to be the next tranche of funding that gets released. So maybe talk a bit about the significance of middle mile as the state's evaluating projects, what they can do to invest in middle mile, but real quickly, if you will, help clarify sort of a point of confusion, because it is. We're talking about grants that we were targeting to rural areas, but then we're looking at a map. We'll show that what I think is a brilliant map that shows the preferences that NTIA laid out in their NOFA. We've used that term. It's the Notice of Funds Opportunity. That's the federal, when the rules are published by the federal government, by a federal government agency. So they published their preferences, which effectively said, we want to target this particular round of funding where we can get the biggest bang for the buck, and mostly interpreted as more densely populated areas. So it was a balance, right, Fred, between unserved areas that had sort of higher density of households.
So there was an element to the application evaluation process for this particular grant program, BIP, that did look at cost efficiency on a per premise basis. And that's not uncommon, but if that is always the case with every grant program, then there are the lower density areas across rural America are at the best going to just have to reconcile with being at the end of the line, and they are going to be the last to ever be served. If that's always the case, then you'll only get to those locations once all other locations are connected. And sometimes areas that are very, very lightly populated, low density, actually do have some middle mile or some backhaul facilities present, perhaps just by coincidence. Oftentimes they don't. So that is part of the reality. Other funding programs coming up, for example, the ARPA funding, the Capital Projects Fund, as well as the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund from ARPA, and the BEAD program. Most of those broadband infrastructure funds will flow down through the states again, so through the state broadband offices, and those broadband offices will have some discretion as to how and where to spend the funding. They'll have program rules from the NTIA and from the enabling legislation to follow as well, but within that set of rules, they'll have some discretion. So if they want to not take into consideration cost efficiency that's fed by housing density, then they don't have to do that. The temptation to do that is pretty great. When you are building a telecommunications network, a fiber to the premise network, for example, or a fixed wireless network, the more subscribers that you can capture, the better the financial picture looks. And some networks are so sparsely populated, such few users or subscribers over such a large geographic area, that the operations and maintenance costs over time of an ongoing network are of a concern to some network operators. Just the windshield time involved in service calls and customer installations and troubleshooting and things like that. So the issue of serving the most rural parts of America is a very real one. Some funding opportunities historically have addressed that, such as the USDA Reconnect program, but others have not. In terms of middle mile infrastructure, many programs allow for the spending of funding on middle mile infrastructure in order to facilitate connections to unserved or underserved locations. That was the case with the BIP grant. That is the case with the ARPA capital projects funds at the discretion of the state entity. It is allowed under the BEAD program. But once again, it's to facilitate middle mile networks that are necessary to facilitate last mile networks as opposed to standalone. There is a current middle mile grant opportunity administered by NTIA. The window for applications is actually already open, will stay open until September 30th. And that's an exclusively for middle mile networks, intentionally those that don't actually connect end users along the way, but have accommodations to be able to connect end users. So middle mile for the sake of middle mile. They still want to see the value of that middle mile network, that it can connect community anchor institutions and can facilitate last mile networks, but it doesn't have to have specific last mile networks defined for that program.
Thank you, Fred. And I'm noting the clock that we have 14 minutes before we are at the top of the hour. And so we're kind of moving into some audience Q&A as we speak. But Will and Mike, maybe Mike, start with you. We've got questions about the fabric itself and maybe talk about, what's available to states. There was a question about, is this only available in Maine? And then Will, if you will, speak to, how CostQuest data gets ingested into the broadband intelligence platform alongside other important data layers and capabilities. So Mike, you first.
Yeah, so to get out ahead of questions and answer more directly some of the questions out there on the fabric, look for a public notice from the FCC within days on the national fabric that's going to be available for the BDC program. Now, that data that's going to be available to ISPs and states and interested parties can only be used for the BDC program. You have to sign an end user licensing agreement. You can use that for free. If you're using it for other things like network planning, public maps, things like that, you can license the data. We have it in all 50 states. Some areas are better than others. We're working with the FCC and the crowdsourcing of additional data to get the data great in every state. But it is very good, and a number of states have already licensed that data for programs such as the one in Maine. Maine always seems to start things like good ideas start in Maine and then just kind of go clockwise. But it is available everywhere else now. Does that hit that, Brian?
Yes, I believe it does.
Yeah, and I think there's some more questions coming that Joan's going to field, but do you want me to take Brian's question first, Joan?
It depends. I mean, we have about 12 minutes. We probably won't get to every question, just based on my past experience. What I did try to do was, and this is a great response we had from the audience, I did try to pick out the ones that could be answered with like 1 or 2 words or a sentence or 2. So maybe we should just go through those, and then maybe, some of your thoughts could be worked in with that. Does that work for you all?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Okay, Brian. Okay.
There are actually a couple that are related to that Will question. So maybe just address that.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead.
Is that for me? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So fabric data or address location level data in VETRO, we have a GIS database that's built in the cloud for scale and can store, manage, and visualize and display millions of points, target locations for an ISP to design to, or for a state to plan to. One thing I think is, I agree with Mike, kudos to Peggy for being a year ahead of everybody else, at least, and trying new things fearlessly and successfully. Because one thing that I think is very cool is, rather than taking a state as a blank slate and saying, inviting people to submit applications to build stuff any way they want, Connect Maine decided to, utilizing fabric data, similar to what we looked at with the color-coded NTIA map as a grant applicant, now as a grant maker, take the state, chop it up into puzzle pieces for priority areas to fund, and then invite people to bid on those predefined geographies or polygons or units. Other states are doing that now, and we've built tooling around that in the platform to allow both the state to generate, manage those target funding areas, and for would-be applicants to visualize and analyze and then submit interest to bid on those areas. So there's, Peggy's on both sides of the coin here. This conversation is about grant applications to NTIA, but now grant making down to the ISP level, and we like to be a bridge in the middle of it all with the intelligence platform, because the maps are what everyone kind of unifies around, common language.
So I took the questions that have come in so far and picked out some of the ones that are really quick to answer, and I'm going to address them to a specific person so that I think that'll save us a little time. So this one I think is best for Peggy perhaps, but others can jump in if that's appropriate. Will this generate new construction works? I think they're meaning, will it generate jobs? I don't know if you folks, anyone of you did estimates of how many jobs would be created as a result of this project or anything like that?
You know, we didn't have to, so we didn't, right? There was a lot of stuff that had to generate, and that was one of the things, so we didn't check that box. This will, you know, that we're going to employ, well, not we, the ISPs that are building out these networks will employ people to build out these networks. Some of it for Consolidated, they have a workforce that they use to regularly build out, and they're overlashing their existing networks. So that's the process they're going to use. The Somerville, Jefferson, and Idaho, and well, so most of the other ones are greenfield builds. They're building new, and so that will employ, you know, other people to do that kind of work.
Great. And this question is for Fred. Is Tilson handling design and management of installation? I realize there's different answers for different providers, perhaps. Are you involved in any of the actual design and network?
Not the designs. The design is up to the service providers themselves. They did provide details of what the basic parameters are, the type of infrastructure, you know, for example, GPON or XGS-PON network, and what split ratio, just so we can make sure that the performance of the network was suitable for the performance requirements of the grant funding. And we will be administering the construction to the extent that we are making sure that it's compliant with the construction schedule. There's a very aggressive timeline for this project to make sure that things are built on time and of sufficient quality, so to speak, that everything is compliant with the program rules.
Question for Mike: is CostQuest data available at the household level nationwide? And are wired broadband routes available at the Connect Maine and public broadband availability maps? So maybe that's a question for both Mike and for Peggy.
Yeah, I can't touch the wired routes thing, but yeah, the broadband fabric location data is available US wide. We're also territories will be available with this upcoming version through the FCC. So yeah, nationwide it's available.
So we have our public facing map is called our I don't know what it's called, but it's that's an old platform, and we will be over this next year, well, probably sooner than that, probably next 6 months, switching to making part of the broadband availability, broadband intelligence platform, our public facing map. So the public facing map we have now is mostly based on FCC data, not horribly accurate. We don't use it that much, but we will be moving from that to the broadband intelligence platform as part of our public facing process.
And I think we answered there was a question about VETRO whether VETRO had middle mile maps showing where middle mile providers are located. I think we answered that one. Did we not, Fred?
I'm not sure. Will can probably speak to that.
Yeah.
No, sorry, we don't have mapping of all fiber routes in the country or existing middle mile routes.
There are some commercial services. There are a few commercial services that have that for a fee connected to fiber locator. They're not necessarily completely accurate or comprehensive, and they're pay for services.
Yeah,
we're constantly looking for that information, and it's sometimes not easy to find.
And I have several questions that I think are probably most appropriate for Peggy, but Peggy, let me know if that's not correct. One is the network in development or in the construction process? And I realize the answer will be different for different providers, but maybe you can kind of fill us in on where they are.
So working with the federal government's a lot of fun. So our providers are ready to go. We are in the NEPA process. We have to evaluate, we do a NEPA evaluation to make sure that the fiber that we're hanging on existing poles that have been for 30 years don't violate any environmental laws. So we're in that process. And as soon as that process is cleared, then we will, we have our budget in place. They've approved our 6-month budget, and the process will start. Some of it starts with with make ready and pole attachments, and some of it for CCI will actually starting to build.
And there's a question about who will manage permits and the like.
Yeah, the ISPs are going to do all of that.
Yeah,
It's,
okay.
The permits in Maine are mostly pole attachment, make ready, and almost all of that goes through through CCI.
And there's a question, are there execution deadlines for the disbursement of funds?
Yeah, I mean, the federal grant, the NOFO and the grant contract called us to have all these projects built within a year. We are now heading towards 6 months and have not moved, not because of our fault. We've been pushing, but we're ready to go, and we could possibly have most of these projects built within a year. We have a couple that may take a little longer. We have the potential tower on Idaho that needs to get built, which is problematic. But we're going to push to get this grant done. Probably not within a year, but we'll do it within a year and a half. We'll do it as fast as we can.
Yeah. And is there some type of a petition process if you need a little more time? I assume.
Yes, we have to ask the NTIA for an extension, but I don't anticipate any problems since most of our holdups so far have in fact been them.
Okay. And there was another question about, and I'm not sure who wants to jump in on this one, how useful the speed test data was.
It was useful during, so speed test data by itself is, it's good and it's bad, right? But it gives you indications. Nobody's saying that this is it, right? This is the truth. There's no true truth. But the speed test data is an excellent indicator of trends and in areas where service is bad, right? If a lot of people do speed tests and everybody comes up bad, then there's a problem there. And so it was helpful as part of we had a big packet to respond to for the challenges. We gave them a lot of stuff that showed why they were wrong, and speed tests were part of that data.
There's also a question if you expect to be the agency that will be handling NTIA funding programs.
So Maine has we like this model called this public instrumentality of the state. And last year we created a new one for broadband called the Maine Connectivity Authority, which is going to replace Connect Maine. We have some limitations in our statute, which makes it hard for us to use federal money as flexibly as we want to. And so we created a new entity to do that, and they will be handling all the federal money. They're in the process of staffing up and filing their capital projects fund plan and getting ready to file their 5-year their request for the 5-year money to put together the B plan and the DEA plan. Yeah.
Okay, I think we got to almost all the questions. There will be a process where the people who are on the panel can get back to people if we missed any. I think we got to almost all of them. I'm going to turn it back to Brian. I know you had another question for Peggy.
Joan, thank you. That was an impressive speed round there. Thank you for managing that. This group here that's in front of you, we spend quite a bit of time together, and a lot of that has happened in Maine, and like I said, other states that Tilson and CostQuest and VETRO work together in. But today, of course, is about Maine and Connect Maine. And Peggy's going to get a little uncomfortable when I make this more about her right now. But you gloss over this, Peggy. But you're going to hang up the spikes here at the end of July.
They're called drops in this business. The drops, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hang up the splicer for a bit. You mentioned the Maine Connectivity Authority. So if you don't mind, just talk a bit more about the work that Andrew Butcher and Stephanie McClagan are doing to sort of take that baton. But importantly, if you don't mind, tell us what's next for Peggy Schaffer.
So first, the Maine Connectivity Authority is ramping up, right? And so they're staffing up. We meet regularly. I don't know, like 3 times a day. It seems like I'm meeting with them. We're all meeting together as a team to put together the capital projects plan, which both VETRO and Tilson are helping us with, getting ready to put the funding in for BEAD. I mean, this deadline for states, July 15th, the DEA budget's due, August 12th, the BEAD budget's due, the NOFO for the competitive middle mile is due mid-September. I don't know what NTIA was thinking, but in Maine, we like to take vacations in the summer. I don't know what they were going for there. So and the Maine Connectivity Authority is scrambling, right? They're working very diligent, like every state agency is across the country. Every state's doing this to get ready to go. And why partnerships like this are really important is because states can't do this. Most states are like ours, right? They have 2 or 3 people working for them. So it's important that we have these teams of people, which consist of willing ISPs, communities, consultants who are going to help us really make sure that we do what this money is intended to do, which is get to everybody, right? That's our goal, to provide a high quality, low cost service to everyone in the state, in the country, actually. And my next step, actually, I retired July 29th. And I am going to, I haven't had a vacation and I couldn't tell you how long. I can tell you how long. I have 11 weeks of vacation stored up. I am going to spend about 3 weeks sitting in my kayak in Copscook Bay, which is way down East Maine, where I do not have good internet, by the way. Just I really have bad internet there.
That can be a good thing sometimes.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you all, Brian, Will, Peggy, Frederic, Mike. I think this was a great discussion today. Clearly, there was a lot of interest in this topic, and we really appreciate your participation. Thank you also to those who were watching for logging on today. Thank you so much.